Well, as we're considering this morning the Reformation, this is the time of thinking through the Reformation. We are nearing that time where historically it's known that this relatively unknown monk, Martin Luther, nailed 95 theses to the door of the Wittenberg Church, and it just set Western Europe on fire over a period of 25 years or so. And it just continued on into the late 1500s and into the 1600s. And that history shaped a lot of who we are today in the idea of the Reformed movement and the Reformed Baptist movement, even here in America. Even our own confession was fashioned out of the fires of the Reformation, so to speak. And so one of the things, though, is to recognize that sometimes we take and put a focus on some particular individuals like Martin Luther or John Knox or John Calvin or Zwingli or Bucer or someone like that. And those are good things to do. There's nothing wrong with that. But sometimes it gives us an idea that there, was just some volcanic explosion, but it has no real explanation. Now, if you're not careful, and many historians do this, and this happens in science as well, science sometimes will divorce itself from God. It will say, oh yeah, we see this order, and this order is great, but there's no God that has anything to do with that. Well, that's a problem. Historians can do the same thing. They look at it from a completely humanistic perspective, and they see all these factors, and then they factor out God. Well, that's a bad issue and a bad problem too. And so what we want to see is that there's a growth, there's a movement that's happening in Western Europe during the time of the Protestant Reformation that really is not an entity to itself. It was born out of something else, and it's a reminder that God is at work in all the different ages. Even if you want to call the medieval period the Dark Ages, I'm not necessarily sure that's the greatest name for it, okay? And you'll have historians debate that, and some of you may say, oh, but the gospel wasn't there. Brr. Well, that's not really true. The gospel was there because God was saving people. He has his people in every age, in every generation. And if we really dug into the Middle Ages, as many historians have, you'll find that God was saving people. Were there bleak issues? Yes. Were there dark moments? Yes. But it's not as though God was not at work. And that's important in the idea of the background of the Protestant Reformation. Now, I'm going to kind of work through, that's the early church again. And now, this morning, I just want you to see this one more time before we move on. You see that area up there that says Germany, all right? And then you go down just a little bit west and south of there is France. Well, those two places become really important in the middle portions of the medieval period or Dark Ages or Middle Ages, whatever you want to call them. They become important in the context, look a little further south there, to Italy. When we get into 1000 AD, there begins to be kind of this circular fight that starts between Italy, Germany, and France. And Germany is going to be phasing out of its importance. France is going to become really important, and Italy and France are going to go back with each other. And we'll have just a moment to discuss some of that, because you need to see some of that in the context of what is happening to lead up to the Reformation. So kind of keep that map in your mind. Germany, France, Italy. For centuries in the Middle Ages, Rome and Italy, that was the place of the papacy. That was the formations of what we now call the Roman Catholic Church. And so you're going to see the Roman Catholic Church, and we're going to go back to our slide from last week about the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, and then that moving downward to give us a reminder of this feudal system that had been at work. Okay? And so you see there, the Pope, the Church, and God. Now, for the early portions of the medieval period, this framework had been important over the whole of Western Europe, but the king portion of that was really focused on Germany. And it was the Pope who would put the Holy Roman Emperor in, and for a portion of this medieval period, this Holy Roman Emperor was focused in Germany. And so you had the Pope and the German Emperor. They were kind of in tandem working together, and the Pope was always trying to do what over the Holy Roman Emperor? Keep him in check. And what do emperors really love? They really love people trying to keep them in check, don't they? Is that what emperors love? No, they don't love that. So what begins to happen is, although the Pope is trying to have this in-charge mentality over the whole of Christendom, remember that was our idea last week. The Roman Catholic Church wanted to have this great unity. All right? So the Pope is going to bring about this great unity of all of Christendom across the Western Church. We're not dealing with the Eastern Church, but the Western Church. And so they come up. Now you got to understand, I'm trying to take 1,000 years and condense it, okay? So, there's a lot of detail, and I can point you some places to do some reading. There's one historian I really like his name. His name is Preserved Smith. You ever heard of him? I like that name. I don't know who his parents were. The last name's great, but that first name, I'm not sure where they came up with that, but maybe it was something to do with God. I don't know. But old Preserved Smith, he talks about this friction that is between the Holy Emperor, Roman Emperor, and the Pope in Germany. And they start to kind of grate on one another. And you'll get into figures like Charlemagne and the Charlemagne dynasty, the Carolingian dynasty. You can read about these things. But as they have this friction one with another, back and forth, over a period of time, the princes in the different regions of the German Empire, they get kind of frustrated in the feudal system because they're having to deal with the nobles, the lords, the vassals, the merchants, the farmers, way more than the Holy Roman Emperor is. So every time the Pope and the Emperor are going at each other, or they're trying to put out these edicts to all the people, the princes in Germany, they're the ones they're more local. They're having to deal with all of the fallout of the governmental aspects of that. Well, in a feudal system like this, that becomes a problem because merchants and farmers, they're not getting what they need, so they're going to fight and struggle with one another, and then they're going to go to their princes, and they're going to just go after one another. Well, when princes have to turn knights on their own local people or soldiers on their own local people, that doesn't go well. So when you have these kind of skirmishes over a period of time, that begins to bring problems, and the Holy Roman Emperor is going, no, wait a second. You're not going to tell me what to do with my people. Well, what does the Pope do? The Pope says, oh, yes, I will. And as they fight with one another, over a period of time, the Pope says, you know what? Fine. You Germans are nothing but just a bunch of warmongers, and you're always just causing problems. And so you do whatever you want, but you will be under my power. Then you start to have problems with Germany and France and Italy together. And when you have those problems together, Germany becomes weakened. And when Germany becomes weakened, it loses its stranglehold on the Holy Roman Empire, and you begin to see in the 10th and 11th centuries a switch that the Holy Roman Emperor is now in France. Now, there's a lot of war, there's a lot of politics, there's a lot of problems that bring that about. But you have to see there's kind of a circular movement or a triangular movement. Italy, Germany, France, and they're all kind of fighting with one another over all this power. Well, now think about that for a minute. If Martin Luther is going to come to the forefront in 1517, if there had still been a Holy Roman Emperor who was in Germany, it would have been more difficult for the Reformation to start in Germany. But God weakened the power of the German Empire in all of the politics, and that began to move to France. Even really what was almost 400 years before Luther. So God's working these things out over time. Now, last week we talked a lot about this feudal system. So the economic system is getting worked out. People are tired of this system. Money becomes a standard. And the church is in the middle of how to deal with that money situation. But now we're talking about the politics of it all. You're seeing what is worked out economically and politically over time. There's a lot happening in 1,000 years and much less 400 years for this Reformation to come about. From about 1100 AD up to 1500 AD, you see the French Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope go at it for about 300 years or so. If you were to read a little bit about these relationships between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor in the later portions of the Middle Ages, you would see nothing but one friction issue after another. Honestly, most of the time it's just over money and power. Think of it this way. Philip of France becomes the Holy Roman Emperor in somewhere around 1100 AD. I don't remember right off the top of my head at the moment. But he becomes the Holy Roman Emperor, and he begins to desire to have his own power, and he wants Boniface, who's the Pope at the time, to give in to him. And Boniface says no. The reason Boniface says no, though, is because what the Holy Roman Emperor in France wants to do, Philip is at war, and he wants clergy in France to start giving monies toward the war effort. Now, think about this for a minute. He puts a tax on the clergy to support his war effort. What does that tax on the clergy do to the church? What? Say it again. Moves it to Italy. All right. It moves the money, okay? It moves the money from one place to another. But the money, Philip of France is taking that money and bringing it to France to go out and go to war. But when he's taxing the clergy, he's actually taking money away from the church. Now, if you're the Pope, do you want money to go away from the church? And especially to support a particular war? The only way that would work is if the war was ordained by the Pope. And the Pope was not ordaining the war. The Pope in and of himself was saying, no, that's not what we want to do right now. Why? Because it was not in the best interest of what he wanted in his power. When we see this worked out over time, this begins a relationship that Boniface ultimately makes a papal decree. And he makes this papal decree and edicts against Philip directly and says that if you do not stand under the authority of the Pope in everything that the Pope says, now I'm paraphrasing here, but I want you to get the sense of it. It's quite a long edict. In everything that the Pope says, you will not have salvation. And that included Philip. So he's now made an edict that Philip, if he will not bow to the Pope, is not going to be saved. That's quite an interesting concept, isn't it? Well, what does Philip do? Philip says, you know what? I've had enough of you. He goes after Boniface has a group of people go after him and kidnap him and imprison him. Now, after a little while being in prison, Boniface has some people that rescue him out of prison. I'm always amazed when I read those things in history about somebody like that being, rescued out of a prison. I'm thinking, how in the world did that happen? These prisons must not have been like the prisons we think of today. You know what I'm saying? I mean, how do you just walk in and get a pope out of prison? A big sword. Or a big wand, yeah. I'm sure there's all kind of political issues behind it. But you think about this for a minute. This kind of friction continues between the French Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope over these next 300 or 400 years, one pope after another. All the while along, what's happening is the church is losing its power. The church is losing its power because of several things. One is the economic system we talked about last week. There's a movement in the monies now. People are more free to gain money in and of themselves. It's no longer a barter system per se or a trade system. Now there's actually a gold standard and there's money being worked out between individuals and a person has their own cash. And that kind of money flowing to some of these lords and even vassals and merchants, that kind of money is weakening the church because these individuals don't need the feudal system anymore and they don't need the church to give them authority to move in the economic system. Then, when you have these political entities always going back and forth, the German emperor has already been weakened. Because the princes, it's more local now, the princes are saying, look, we can't deal with this. We have people that we're dealing with on the ground here. You guys are fighting this out on high while our people are really struggling and we're not going to deal with this. You're taking our authority away as local princes. And the German Holy Roman Emperor is weakened to the point that you have these German states in a sense. That can allow somebody like Martin Luther to come to the forefront. France and Italy, now they go back and forth with one another. The friction between the two of them politically begins to weaken that relationship between Pope and King in the rest of Western Europe. So you're having this weakening relationship in politics for the church. You're having a new money system weaken the way the church can gain money. And so what was the church's answer to being able to get more money in this new money system? What is on the increase during the latter part of the Middle Ages and especially as we go into the early portion of the Reformation? They're trying to monetize salvation. This is where we see indulgences come to the forefront. Indulgences had been around for a while, but when you're losing these relationships of power and money, the papal system doesn't have the money it once had to be able to build these big edifices and buildings, to be able to do the things it wants to do politically, because how is the church working behind the scenes to get people on their side? Lands and money. Well, if you're weakening in both power and money, what are you going to do? You have to create a money stream. And indulgences become this money stream, so much so in the latter portion of the Middle Ages and the early portion of the Reformation. This is one of the things that sets Martin Luther and others ablaze, literally just head on fire to take on the Roman Church. Now, those are two issues. The third issue that I want you to see in the background, and once again, you remember, we're condensing a lot of information here, but I'm wanting you to see that there's a background to the Reformation itself. When we get to some of the moral issues and the doctrinal issues, I want you to see those doctrinal issues in a background, in a whole of a canvas, and not just justification by faith alone. Blah, 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 blah. It just came out of thin air. Wah! No, there's a whole background to it. The third issue is the cultural developments in the Middle Ages. I've got a slide for that, I think. Yes. So we have the cultural developments for the Middle Ages. Firstly, it's the Renaissance itself. Renaissance. As a good Southerner, I just say Renaissance. There's a lot that goes into thinking about the Renaissance period. One writer says, when we hear of the Renaissance, perhaps what immediately springs to mind is its art and the famous artists who flourished at the time, such as Donatello, Botticelli, Da Vinci, Raphael, Michelangelo, and Titian. Certainly there was an artistic dimension to the Renaissance. Still, this was only one facet of a more complex movement, the true nature of which is a subject of ongoing debate. Now, if you take the Renaissance, and how many of you ever heard anybody give a lecture on the Renaissance before that you remember? Okay, some of you have heard that. You, in school, in our, you've heard something on the Renaissance. If you went to a public school or a private school, and if you've gone to homeschool, you've heard something about the Renaissance. And the Renaissance often is attached to the idea of the art. But really the Renaissance was a whole cultural rebirth. And that's really what the word Renaissance means. It means rebirth. You can't just single out one definition of the Renaissance, such as art, and say it's an art period. No, it's a period of great cultural growth in everything. Literature, finance, not just the context of literature, but going back to the font, as they like to say. When we think about the Renaissance, we have to think about a whole movement culturally. One writer says, perhaps the closest we can get to expressing the core of the Renaissance is to say that it was a movement cradled in the love of ancient Greek and Roman culture and a desire for its rebirth in the present. That's pretty overarching and all-encompassing. You have to think about that for a minute because kind of make some connections here. The Pope is central in Italy and Rome, right? Okay, Italy and Rome. All right. The name of the emperor is the Holy Roman Emperor. What had birthed even Western culture? What had given rise to Western culture's birth in Europe? The Roman Empire. The Roman Empire had come about through what movement? The Greek cultural movement. If you read much on the Roman Empire, the early Roman Empire was always trying to be the Greek culture set in a Roman context. They were always fighting to be Greeks, even though they weren't Greeks. And it's because the Greeks were viewed in all of their philosophy as some of the wisest of the ancient world. And they had not just wisdom literature, but they had a financial system and a governmental system, and they had all this architecture, and so there were all these advances in Greek culture that Romans wanted, but Romans were different in and of themselves. They had a different spirit about them, and oftentimes Greeks would look down on Romans, so Romans wanted to prove we can take Greek and do it better. And so when you see the emergence of the Roman Empire before Christ, leading up to Christ, during the time of Christ, and after Christ, when you see the emergence of the Roman Empire, you're seeing an empire that politically is stout, including its war machine. It's stout. You're seeing financially an empire that is very stationed, and you're seeing literature and art at one of its best in the ancient world. Now, this gave rise to the Greek language moving from the Greek states in a more Middle Eastern context to the Greek language moving where? West. And the Romans take Greek and move it all over the Western world. And then the New Testament is written in what? Koine Greek, the common Greek language of the Roman Empire. So there is a sense of a rebirth in and of itself during the Roman Empire, and it led to this great culture, and the Christian religion from the New Testament scriptures goes forward and takes over large swaths through the gospel going out. And so what does the Roman church want to do in the medieval period? After there's been a time of struggle and the falling of the Roman Empire, and the Muslims have come in and they've started not only taking over portions of the Middle East, but they've moved up and they've taken Constantinople. Why was it important that the Muslims took Constantinople? That was the town of Constantine, the Roman Empire. Here's the Roman emperor, his town is now taken. And so what does the Roman church through the Holy Roman Emperor want to do? They want a rebirth of that Renaissance, of that culture of the Roman Empire. They want the Renaissance. They want the rebirth of that. And in trying to achieve that, the Renaissance comes in saying, you know what, church, you've lost your way. You've made the Christian religion your own entity, and you've done something with it, and you've lorded it over the people, and you begin to see city-states and nations start to fight back against the Roman Catholic Church. That's why you see these emperors like Philip going after the Pope. They're tired of having it lorded over them. Now, Philip was no great Christian emperor. Okay, I don't want you to get that idea. It was just a power struggle. But when you go back and you read from, say, 1000 AD to 1500 AD, and you see these relationships between the Pope and their emperors going south, a part of that is because of the power struggle, and a part of that is because of this rebirth that's happening in the culture. They're getting a hold of the Greek literature of the past. And they're saying, the Roman Empire was not like this, Pope. When the Roman Empire was great, it was not like this. And not even Constantine did this to us. In that rebirth, in its literature, is the literature of the individual self in philosophical thinking becomes very important. This was a time of the rediscovery of this classic literature, as one writer says, of ancient Greece and Rome. It's kind of interesting because what this leads to is that they lived in a medieval Latin world, but many wanted a revived Latin world. out of the Roman Empire came not only Greek, but eventually Latin had taken back a frame of importance in all of the culture. So much so that the Greek language had been relegated to a very low level. And so you had a very high level of thinking in a medieval Latin world. One writer says the Renaissance involved a revival of classic forms of thought, expression, and action. A revival mediated through humane studies. When we say humane studies, we're talking about the studies of grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, philosophy. The Renaissance becomes important because the common man in the feudal system had been so oppressed to the point that they had very little education. There was very little ability for them to read and write and understand anything of consequence. They just basically had to find subsistence living day to day. And in the idea of Renaissance, the rebirth was, let's go back to a day where there was a greater, wider degree of understanding of grammar and rhetoric and philosophy and history and poetry. Now, in one sense, we can see where this will be a problem. If you're going to have philosophy from a completely, what we would call in modern sense, a humanistic point of view, you're going to end up with a problem because you're going to humanize everything to the point that you factor God out. History can factor God out. Science can factor God out. Philosophy can factor God out. But in reality, really the Reformation needed this revival. The Reformation needed a revival of this grammar and rhetoric because it brings Greek back into the forefront. It brings the Greek culture back in, but with that, it brings back in the Greek language. Now there's an Erasmus, who's one of the Roman figures that you've heard of. A lot of people don't like Erasmus, and there's good reasons to disagree with him. But you need to be thankful that God used him because he brought the Greek language back to the forefront, and he translated the first Greek New Testament Bible, and really what was the New Testament in its sense, in some 1,000 years or more, since the time before Jerome. Who gets a hold of the Greek New Testament that Erasmus translated? Martin Luther. Without the Renaissance period, without this rebirth, God is using that to bring about having this Greek language come back to the forefront, and Erasmus gets a hold of that. Now, his reasons aren't the same as Luther's, and he and Luther will go back and forth with one another over serious doctrinal issues that needed to be dealt with. But even Luther himself thanks Erasmus and gives credit to Erasmus for being able to bring that Greek New Testament forward so that he then could translate the Greek New Testament into a German Bible for the German people. And subsequently, this would happen all over Western Europe. Yes? We're going to get to that next week. Yeah, we're going to get to that next week. That's one of the moral failures. Yep. I'm glad you asked. Good question. And we're going to get to that next week. So you can see here this Renaissance, this rebirth of coming back to this classic literature. Don't think, if you go read a biography of Luther, and it's a brief biography, and all of a sudden Luther just comes up with this translation of the German Bible, he doesn't come up with that out of nowhere. He comes up with that because of the Renaissance period. That several hundred years leading up to this time, it enables this old literature to be found and to be thought through and it to go through the culture in such a way that Erasmus says, you know what? There's all these texts in these Roman monasteries. There's all these texts, and sadly, we have some of those texts were burned because some of these monks didn't really know what they were, didn't really care. They were burned because they needed to stay warm in the winter. But there are all these texts that he could go back, and he took Jerome's Latin and he comes up with a Greek New Testament. And Luther reads this Greek New Testament and sees the gospel. This Renaissance, this rebirth was very much a part of the Reformation. Don't read the Middle Ages and the Renaissance period and purely look at the Renaissance period as though everything in it was awful and God should have damned it all. There are certainly portions of it we don't want to agree to, but God used that providentially as a part of bringing forth the Reformation, and you're getting just a little bit of that in this context. Well, I have to close here. So you've seen this morning, you've seen last week economic issues bring about the Reformation. It's a formation over the medieval period. There's political issues going on, especially in the latter portions of the Middle Ages. Okay? And then you're getting an idea of the rebirth, the Renaissance period, and how important it is. These three factors come together to form or to help form what we would call the Reformation. And then there's some other things that we'll deal with next week. Roman Catholic Church failures, which Pat asked the question about, the issue of celibacy, medieval inventions, and so forth. All right, let's close in prayer. Heavenly Father, you are merciful as the one God who has decreed all things, even a period that some may call the Dark Ages. You had a purpose in it. You were working in it. Even in spite of man's faults and failures and sinfulness and sinful nature, you purposed even that medieval period. Even at times when the light of the gospel seemed so dim, you were working to save your people, and you did not lose one of them. So we praise you and give honor and glory to you, that you are the God of all the ages. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.